I'm Benjie de la Peña. I'm the CEO of the Shared Use Mobility Center. I'm also the chair of the Global Partnership for Informal Transportation. And I write a newsletter, which is probably why you're here, or maybe you just wandered in from the summit and said, what's this thing? It could be interesting. I write a newsletter on informal transportation called Makeshift Mobility, makeshiftmobilitysubstack.com. For the benefit of our viewers who may be visually impaired, I am a middle-aged Asian man with brown skin. I'm wearing dark rimmed glasses, and I have a blue shirt. And I'm coming to you from LA, where I'm visiting my SAMSI team for the first time. It was my first trip ever post-pandemic. So it's good to all see you here. Maybe what we can do is just quickly go around the room and just say your name and, you know, whatever affiliation you have and or how you feel about informal transportation. Let's keep it very brief. And I mean this to be more of a meet and greet. And then I'm going to ask, what interesting thing have you seen about informal transportation? I'm going to start with one of the deans of innovation in the academic world and in corporate world, Eric von Hippel, who is, you know, one of the pillars of MIT Business School Sloan. Eric, tell us about you. I already have introduced you.
Yes, you have. Well, I met Benjie because I'm really very interested in grassroots innovation. And as Benjie has pointed out, when you have a city which consists of 90% informal transport, what really is the system? Is it the government system or is it the informal system? So I study that kind of thing. I study user innovation in general. And I'm just pleased to know Benjie because of his focus.
Thanks, Eric. Anyone else want to go next?
I can go. Hey, everyone. My name is Mehul Malhotra. I'm a grad student at Arts Center College of Design in Pasadena. And I've been following Benjie's newsletter for a while now, since he came on as a guest lecturer at one of our classes. And I'm actually pursuing a graduate thesis in how informal transportation from the global south can inspire new models of mobility in the Western world. And so, yeah, excited to be here and talk to you guys.
Anyone else want to go? I'm going to pick on Andrea, my colleague.
Hi everyone. My name is Andrea. I'm from Costa Rica and I'm based in Costa Rica. I come from the climate and sustainability world, and I fell in love with cities and the intersection between people, climate, and cities. And of course, I met Benjie a couple of years ago, and we hit it off and found a lot of common interests. And now we're working together in the Global Partnership for Informal Transportation, trying to find more equitable ways to improve our cities and to go through low carbon development paths in the global south. So great to meet you all, and it's really exciting to be here.
Anyone else want to go? Nathan, since you have your camera on and it's 2 a.m. in Singapore.
Yeah, hi everyone. Good morning from Singapore. I'm a part-time diploma student taking a course in the rapid transit technology. So as you know, Singapore is very urbanized, so not much informal transport. So I remember Benjie just called me an outlier there back then. So now it's a running joke between him and I. But I have every interest in every type of transport because we have to get people moving. And recently, I've joined Mobility Data, and I've learned that they are also working on GTFS for informal transportation. So I'm interested to see where that goes. Yeah.
Very interesting. I didn't mean you, Nathan, being an outlier. I meant Singapore. People like saying Singapore's an amazing, amazing city. But I always like to say, well, find me another place with one layer of government. Because everywhere else it's like city, the regional government, the national government, and it's like and then the agency. So we all want to be like Singapore. We'll start with collapsing government maybe to one layer. Anyone else want to introduce themselves? And it's totally fine if you don't want to turn on your mic, your camera, but you might want to turn on your mic to say something, or if you don't want to speak, that's fine too. So Israel, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm Israel Ramirez with the Shared Use Mobility Center. I'm the Communications Associate and Social Media Manager. I'm one of the people helping out with the tech for the summit. I'm also one of the main writers and curators for our Mobility Hub newsletter. So if you're interested in anything about that, you can just, reach out to me or Benjie, and yeah, just kind of plugging in our own newsletter in this meta newsletter session.
Anyone else?
I can go.
Go ahead, Wesleyan.
Hi, I'm Wesleyan. I'm currently based in Philly. I'm working as a research intern for ITDP this summer, and I am a graduate student at Penn. Before going to grad school, I worked for the Philippines Department of Transportation. So Benjie, I know of you, but we've never really had the chance to meet before, but I know that we've met a couple of my colleagues. So I'm happy to chat and happy to be here.
Fantastic. Anyone else? Come on, people, be brave enough. All right. I'm assuming you showed up for this. Either you're interested or you know a little bit about informal transportation. And as Eric said, right, informal transportation dominates the globe when it comes to transportation. Not just in the global south, but it also exists in global north cities, but in the global south particularly. I'm willing, here's the problem. We don't have the numbers because we haven't been taking numbers because we ignore it and talk about equity, right? That we don't count the things that serve more people and employ more people than any of the formal systems. And I got really interested in it more than a day. Well, first of all, I grew up in Metro Manila, as Wesleyan said, right? It's the Philippines, and Philippines is famous for its jeepneys. And there are four-wheeler, they're actually extended jeeps and minibuses, and there's an interesting history of how they developed. They were surplus World War II jeeps, of which there was a whole ton that had been flat packed. And then, the locals adapted it and turned it into passenger vehicles. And it's not unique because the term jeepney actually comes from jitney. And the term jitney comes from the US because at the turn of the century, as cars were proliferating, people started to sell seats on their vehicles, and you would pay 5 cents a jeton or a jitney to ride these vehicles. At one point in LA, there were 700 of them and countless thousands across US cities. They were shut down by the trolley operators who asked government to shut them down because they were eating into the formal transit of the day. If you know, LA got built out because of trams, which has some parallels to technology, right? That trolleys were built out by real estate developers who wanted to get people to their suburbs. Once they sold all the real estate, they couldn't afford to run the trolleys. So they turned, and government started controlling it in terms of price. So they turned it over to government. And then at some point, governments, for very good financial reasons, said it wasn't cost effective. Anyway, some background. Right? So jeepneys, informal transportation, and they are everywhere. And they are often treated by planners, primarily Western trained planners. So Wesleyan, pay attention to what they're teaching you in Philly, who think that these are not modern, not efficient stuff. And we want to build the expensive light rail or maybe bus rapid transit. And imagine that once we build it out, all of this informal transportation goes away. But the thing is, it doesn't. And I think something's been happening in the last, I'm going to say 2 years, maybe 3 years, where we're finally coming around to realize that this is the existing transportation system. And we need to figure out how it works. There's been lots of failures of trying to formalize them. Even more recently, lots of failures in trying to impose technology on them. And they tend to fail because we don't understand how they're getting used and how it's important. SSATP, that's the Sub-Saharan African Transport Program of the World Bank, just released a really, really good report on cashless fare collection and fare payment systems. And they look at 5 case studies in the US and in Africa, and 1 case study in India of, how does it work? How does it not work? So I strongly recommend it. It has really, really good takeaways. What happens is the tech companies come. So there's Gojek, which is I think, $18 billion valuation company that started as a motorcycle ride-hailing call center in Indonesia, in Jakarta. And there were already two-wheeler motorcycles in India that you could hail and get to somewhere, right? As taxi cabs. And then the development in the last decade, or towards the end of the last decade, the aughts, was, it's 2 decades back now because we're in the 21, was to create call centers so you could call and get a taxi. So that's how they started. And then they became an app, and now they're a fintech financial payment system, right? You could, in Southeast Asia, pay using your Gojek app, pay for your rent, pay for insurance, pay for your groceries, pay for your funeral plot, right? All of these things that you could do. But they all started from ride hailing. And what is really interesting to me now, and I'm going to open it up, right, to you guys to give some feedback, is there's kind of these, Eric, I'd sent this article to Eric, all these interesting iterations of innovations, right? So the OJEC, the OJAL, I think is what you call them. The OJEC drivers started getting recruited to Gojek, and they would use it. And then they would figure out how it wouldn't work for them. And they return to their old practices. And then there's this whole bunch of apps. They're called gray apps, in that you have to sideload them onto your Android. You can't go through the usual Play Store or your Apple. They're called Tuyul apps. And Cory Doctorow wrote about this in May. And Tuyul is play, I think is an Indonesian word for play, because they're playful apps, and they have various, so there's a whole myriad of them, and they run from, enlarging the print on the Gojek app. So if you're a little older, you can read it, to kind of Gojek or OJEC instructions of where to park in a particular mall, or who's in charge of this. And they're all emerging from the bottom to kind of help the OJEC drivers game Gojek. So there's this dynamic of technological innovation being used up by technological innovation, and it's really fascinating. The other thing that Venkatesh, who works with Ford and is a colleague of Eric, pointed it out to, was how in India the auto rickshaw drivers had started using WhatsApp to connect to customers, and they had like these auto rickshaw communities. And if you weren't available, you'd refer them to someone else in the community, to get around Uber and Ola, who would take 27-30% of the ride fare. So this fascinates me, how it's in the DNA of informal transportation to innovate, and they're continuing to innovate. So I'm gonna open it up and say, what interesting things are you seeing where you are in terms of informal transportation? Or if you're not seeing it, what are the questions that occur to you? I might say it also that it happens in the global north. It's just, it's even more hidden, right? Than
Benjie,
Benjie,
I can add a comment if you like.
Go ahead, Eric.
Yeah, so it's really, it's exciting that you have these wonderful grad students here interested. Where Benjie and I interact is, I study the fact that innovation increasingly comes from users, whether it's in medicine or whether it's in this kind of transportation system. So if you all are interested in this, you say to yourself, it's a general phenomenon. It's not just about, tuktuks or something like that. So people are developing their own medical devices because often they have rare diseases and nobody's going to do it for them. And then when you want to understand the systems like Benjie's talking about, you see the good side of it, namely people with their own private transportation device can earn a living. But then you also see big capital people coming in a way that maybe is not socially so respectful, which is they say, oh, well, we can buy a ton of cars. We're millionaires. We'll buy a ton of cars and we'll rent them out to people who, will earn less money than the person who owns his own. And so we'll sort of, Benjie, you might comment on that. So in a way, what you want to do is use this thing to improve social welfare. And you'll find both wonderful things like people going to the local Tiwala or WhatsApp or whatever as a coordination mechanism, but also bad things that you have to deal with, like capitalists trying to capture all the rents. So I don't know, Benjie, you know, you also notice perhaps and can comment about the some of the downsides that have to be addressed.
I think that's very relevant, particularly when we talk about technology, right? So I'm currently enamored by the writings of anthropologist, ethnographer, Susan Leigh Starr, who passed away sadly in the aughts, but she was doing an early research on information infrastructure and as the internet was growing, and looking at how the socio-technical infrastructure was growing around it. And there's one particular essay where they refer, an essay of another academic who I'm going to forget, but the title of it was, When is a Tool? And it was really interesting because the framing was, a tool is nothing, if we're talking about infrastructure, without context of who's using it, how are they using it, what do they need it for? So you can see a hammer, we all understand a hammer is, but hammer has meaning if you know what is it that you're trying to hammer, or what does it not do. So the frame they take is infrastructure is not a thing, it's a set of relationships facilitated by something. And if you start thinking one of informal transportation as infrastructure is a set of relationships. So the three-wheeler emerges or the two-wheeler emerges because there's no public transportation, or you couldn't fit a bus in there, or there is no formalized government organization that's paying attention to public transportation, they're just paying attention to roads. So that's a relationship thing. And if you start bringing in new technology that's as infrastructure, you're also developing new relationships and maybe hardening power imbalances or aggregating it further to the detriment of existing power structures and existing relationships. So all very fascinating. I gave a presentation to, I'm gonna forget now, I think it was Digital Transport for Africa last week. And one of the points I was making was, it's good that we are thinking about mapping informal transportation. I was a supporter of digital matatus, which was one of the first projects about informal transportation that got it on Google Maps. But the caution I had was, you know, we can't be techno-op. There's these two narratives, right? Informal transportation is problematic. We need to solve it. It's not modern. You know, it's terrible experience for the users. It has all these crime and syndicates on it on one hand. And then the narrative for technology is like, oh, they're multi-billion valuation decacorns. They're kind of high-tech apps, and they come from people who are educated in the West, or they're entrepreneurial. And they approach government, right? And government sees one as a problem and another one as a solution. So there's that power imbalance there. Even if, and I'm also very fascinated by the research of Rita Quadra, who is also from MIT, looking at the OJEC phenomena, right? Even if a company like Gojek takes ideas from the OJECs and then recycles them and then adapts it and throws it up as a platform, and then the OJEC drivers then adapt something else because this doesn't work for them because it doesn't have their interest. So to me, the interesting thing is when we look at infrastructure, including informal transportation as infrastructure and the technology we're putting in, the question behind that needs to be asked, particularly in terms of equity. And I love the first session today in our Mobility Justice Spotlight, if you weren't able to catch it, was that, you know, equity has to be a main ingredient. You have to go look at it and say, what are the existing power relationships? And part of the adaptation that you see in informal transportation are workarounds about power, right? So the reason that you get the jeepneys running or the autorickshaws or the two-wheeler taxis is because people don't have mobility that is formally provided and they need to get somewhere. And so people who with the services will say, okay, here you pay and we'll deliver. And then that develops, and then government comes in and controls it in a certain way, but doesn't correct that power imbalance of both what is prioritized and then what is imagined to be problematic. I'll stop there and ask, you know, anyone have any reactions?
I wanted to just like bring out, I think, something that I think ties to a lot of the stuff that we're talking about as well, where there's this dichotomy between the concept of formality and the concept of informality.
Mm.
And it's either this or this. And a lot of the times it's not, it's some of this and some of this, or somewhere in the middle where you can't understand what that is, right? And I think it's very tough to put that into words and also numbers.
Right.
But I think one of the ways, like you mentioned, Benjie, there's a need to map this out, and there's a need for quantifying it in a way so that people can understand the power of it.
Yeah.
Because when we talk about it, people would, I think, come up and say, oh, don't romanticize these things because there are problems in it, right?
Right.
And there are a lot of labor issues that are very real, which need to be addressed. But I think there's this concept that I came across, and there's a really nice TED talk by Robert Newworth on the power of informal economies. And he brings across this really nice concept of System D, right?
Yeah.
And the amount of power that has, I think there was a really nice fact in there, I think a number which said that if you take all of the informal economy and calculate the GDP that it provides to the world, it becomes, I think, probably the second largest economy behind the US or something like that, right?
Yeah.
And 2/3 of all of the population of the world works in this informal economy.
Right.
And so essentially, why is it informal then if the only thing that's separating it from formal is not being what we already established? Right. And so I think using these kinds of analogies and ways of mapping this to understand this is a system that's valid, as valid as the formal, could be one way that we bring across those points,
Right. There's a lot of research on what they're called large technical systems, right? That develop, like that classic book on the evolution of power systems across Europe and the US, right? And they become very formalized, kind of this industrial modern setup. And then there's research on inverse infrastructure. And I don't know who it was who came up with that term, but the idea is it's bottom-up infrastructure that is self-organizing, right? And it's interesting because we look at even the idea of what is formal and informal is artificial. Because it's not, being informal doesn't mean you're illegal. Because even for vendors, there actually is permits, right? And in fact, you will be faulted for not having a government permit. If you remember, the Arab Spring happened or was kicked off because of a fruit vendor who the police in Tunisia kept confiscating his fruit stand. And he was completely frustrated because that was his livelihood because he didn't have a permit. And if you imagine, the analogy of that is every time you have a driving violation or a speed violation, instead of nicking you with a ticket, the cops would take your car. It's like that, right? So they took, and he basically self-immolated, and that set off the Arab Spring. But there's a permit systems to it, right? So they're not illegal. It's just that the way they're regulated doesn't match their need, and it's because of the priorities of leadership, right? So in Delhi too, like more than a decade, or again, the turn of the decade, to be a cycle rickshaw driver, you needed to get a permit from a veterinarian. You heard me right, a veterinarian. And the reason that was it came from animal carts. And you would get that permit. So to the government, it was like, you're just like an animal cart. They weren't even allowed to cross bridges because they weren't valid transportation, right? So there's a Gaurav Mittal has really interesting research about Vikrams, which is a larger three-wheeler in northern India, and how the informality gets defined by government players by saying what is formal and what is not. If you look at New York City dollar vans, there's a permitting system for New York City dollar vans, and they serve large parts of New York and large parts of New Jersey. A lot of them are in the gray area because there's a permit system in New York City itself because of the requirements are so onerous. Like the insurance requirement, you're required to get insurance for $1 million as a dollar van, and that comes up to something like $1,600 a month in insurance payments. So if you're operating on slim margins, why would you take that, right? At the same time, there's still real demand. So there's this huge mismatch with both a point of view of what it should do and how you regulate it. So Sorry, I could go on with this for days. I'm gonna stop and see if anyone else has a reaction. Thank you for that, Mahul.
Gonna go for it. Thanks, Israel, for keeping the speaking order. I was just gonna comment on what you were mentioning. I'm not sure if it was Eric or Benjie about the who. I think it was Benjie. And I think in this context, the who has two sides. It's like who is providing the service and who does it cater for. And the level of informality and the level of acceptance from the government side of it is very different depending on who that who is. And I think that's also where the gray areas appear. In Costa Rica, for example, there is the public transport, that's the formal one. And then all these informal services started to appear. And the government created a gray area called the special services, which is basically informal transport providers that they recognize and they gave a permit to, but they don't have the same requirements as the public transport providers. They don't have to pay like a canon, they don't have to have all sorts of insurance. They're just like, okay, we'll let you operate because you have a lot of power and you're very annoying and you block the roads if we don't let you operate. So you'll be special services, but there's a limited amount of permits that they can give. And so there's a lot of other informal operators that are not special services. And it's really interesting because a lot of these started out as community providers and people who started bottom up. But then, of course, here comes the power struggles, as Eric was mentioning. Like there's a huge, I like to call it or think about it as like corporate informality. And there's a local version, which is like a huge company that started, they saw a niche in it and they say, okay, there's a lot of companies or transnationals or like business areas that are located in certain places that are not well connected by public transport. So I'm going to get permits to provide minivan services to these places, and they are special services. So it's not public transport and it's not really formal transport, but since they're corporate, they get the permits. But a lot of more like smaller or just one person providers don't get those permits because they don't have like the corporate, the weight of it. And I think that also just adds on to realizing what the power of organization does for these power struggles, and how in some other countries it's been really interesting how unionizing or building or just creating co-ops between the providers at least gives them so much more power when they come to the table to negotiate with the decision makers and with the local governments or the authorities. So I just think that part of the governance and the power struggle and how these corporate informal providers have appeared is really, really interesting. And it really changes the way, it has changed the rules because the government entities were accustomed to those tiny informal providers, and all of a sudden comes these corporate ones like Uber and Lyft. They're kind of pressured to respond also because the who of who they're catering to is another public. It's like the millennials and people with tech and people with money who have a louder voice and demand these types of services, whereas before it was maybe the most vulnerable populations that were just like using them because they had no other choice. So for me, that's really interesting too.
It's
Plus
very
one.
interesting. And by the way, you know, I have to go now. It's 2:30 that you specified, isn't it, Benjie?
That's okay.
I mean, I apologize, but I would love to talk at some other time with you and Andrea both, if we could carry on. So I haven't
For sure. We'll reach out to you,
talking
Eric.
to Benjie every time, and I'm sure, Andrea, once I get to know you, I'll miss talking to you too when you're not around. So thanks to everybody. I was so happy to be here.
Thanks for joining us, Eric.
Okay, bye.
Nathan had his hand up, and so I'll give you second to the last word because we're like Eric said, we're at time already. But Nathan, tell us what your thoughts are.
Yeah, so I just like what Andrea shared. I remember I was at the ITF Virtual Summit and there was a presentation by one of Costa Rica's ministers, I think, but she didn't mention much of informal transportation. So you should definitely share with me more about that. So regarding that fine line between formal and informal, you see, people think that there must always be one extreme end. But I believe that, we can definitely look at something, in the middle. Maybe it's slightly formal, slightly informal, because every city, every town, every village is different. It depends on what the communities need. And so we can shape the offering, the offers based on what is needed by the communities. So I remember I spoke to some people at a Buzzworld webinar, and a lot of them told me that I think 80 to 90% of the bus services there are run by private operators. And so a lot of them mentioned that the state government and all the inefficiencies and all that. So this is why informal transport is important, because even though it looks somewhat there's a bad reputation, say people find it like Benji, you say crimes, maybe people find it dirty and whatever, but this is that line that people fall back on when they do not have other modes of transportations. Yeah, so this is a very important thing. And actually, Benji, I have one very good idea for you. Invite speakers from other countries, like you mentioned about the OJEC. I found that very interesting. Yeah, because you shared that they're actually constantly innovating.
Yes.
And this is actually human nature. Whenever we are pressured to change, we will change. But the thing is, it's not recognized by people. People think that the informal sector is very backdated, But now that you mentioned this, I can see that informal transportation, it is in a way smart, because they know they have to do something in order to keep up with times. So if you can invite people and share the history of their jeepneys, matatus, or boda, all of this, I would be very interested, because I'm still trying to figure out which is which.
Well,
thanks for this.
That's why we need more knowledge. And I think I like what you said about starting from users' needs. Most transportation agencies look at the whole system. How do we make it more efficient? And efficiency is the thing, right? And I was just in that presentation with Digital Transport for Africa last week. Casablanca was presenting, and they built out a tram, and they thought they could replace their what they called white cabs. They built out the tram for millions of dollars and realized people weren't using it, and people were still using the white trams. And they finally turned and say, why? Now we have to understand them and finally use them. So if we start from where users are, rather than thinking in terms of kind of this efficiency frame, then we will really better understand informal transportation. And with that, I'll close there. Thank you for showing up and doing this meet and greet with me. And thank you for, there's the rest of the summit for Tuesday and 2 more Tuesdays and another Thursday after that. So please join us for that. Thank you so much. And share makeshiftmobility.substack.com.